Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs. I'm managing editor for Reminder Publications, and once again I'm hosting a conversation here on Government Matters. Thanks for tuning in. This episode we're going to be talking with District Attorney Anthony Gulluni of Hampden County. Thanks very much for coming by.
My pleasure, Mike.
It's budget season, and like everybody else who gets a chunk of money from the state, I'm sure that you've been very concerned about how the budget is going and what direction it's going in. And especially since Hampden County has got one of the busiest justice systems going, busy courthouse, I'm sure that you're very concerned about what kind of resources your department has. So how does it look so far for you?
So I am very concerned, and when I came into office, it was really one of my key objectives to rectify what I think is a long-standing inequity in Hampden County. What we've done so far has been very hopeful, and I'm very optimistic. So I've had, first and foremost, and I've needed and I've gotten great support from our legislators here in Hampden County, from state representatives to state senators. I've had a number of conversations with the Speaker of the House, Robert DeLeo, the Chairman of Ways and Means, Brian Dempsey, about the situation here. And as you alluded to, Michael, if you aggregate all our numbers in the various courts throughout the criminal justice system in Hampden County, we are, in fact, without really much debate possible, the busiest district in the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We've had the busiest Superior Court most years. Last fiscal year, in fact, we did that year, fiscal year 2016, and our Springfield District Court is usually busiest in competition with Worcester District Court. So again, those numbers are really staggering. And then if you look at our budget, particularly my budget, the Hampden District Attorney's budget, compared to other district attorneys' offices, it just doesn't compute. We're about 5th of 11 different districts across the Commonwealth in terms of our funding. Consequently, I have presently about 69 assistant district attorneys, whereas Suffolk County has 140 or more. Middlesex has 130 or more. And we're doing, as I just laid out, as much, if not more, work than those counties with fewer than half of the assistant district attorneys. So the work that we've done is try to inform people and educate people, both in this district and out in Boston, the decision makers there, about this situation and what's really a glaring unfairness. And that is really the foundation upon which we're trying to rectify our budget situation. So this year, to get to an answer to your question, is we've had great traction, I think, with the relevant people. I've had great support from our local legislators. And the House budget was released a few weeks ago, and I was about 8% above our last fiscal year budget, so about an 8% increase, which is significant. Doesn't quite rectify the situation and get us to where we want to be, but it's going to come probably in increments. Right now, it's up to the Senate. I was fortunate to have the support of Senators Lesser and Welch, who have filed an amendment. The Senate budget did not address the problem for us, so they filed an amendment that's pending that will hopefully get us up to the number. And as you know, the two branches of government there, the House and the Senate, will then confer, produce a budget that will go to the governor for his ratification or not. So we're hopeful. We're working. I've spent a lot of time on the issue, and I think there's some success. We've got to make it the whole way. We had a similar situation last year. Revenue projections didn't quite work out, and everything was sort of neutralized. So we're hoping for some external circumstances to work out, and the work that I've done in the last really couple of years now to finally take hold and produce something significant for this county.
When we say that you're seeing an increase of about 8% in the budget, now would that allow you to increase your staff, do you think, or is that simply keeping up with the demands of salary and other costs that are associated with running your office?
A large majority of any increase I would receive would go to staff. As I indicated, we're down so much compared to our peers in other districts that I would bring people on to make sure that we're doing the best job we can in the courts of Hampden County, as well as outside of the courts in the work we're doing in prevention and education. You know, my staff does an incredibly admirable job. They do terrific work, again, inside the courthouses and outside, but their caseloads are very, very high. As we're all well aware, situations in Springfield and Holyoke and all over this county present real challenges. We've had a number of sort of unfunded mandates in the last couple of years. talk about the opiate problem. This is something that's been really thrust on the criminal justice system to a large extent because the nature of addiction often comes with crime. So we're dealing with some very serious issues that have really, I think, risen the workload that we have. And we're taking it on and we're doing a fantastic job. But in terms of doing the best job that we can, making sure we're equipped for all our challenges coming down the road, including casinos and population growth and so forth, it would really go almost exclusively to new salaries and to new employees to make sure that we're in the best position possible to handle the criminal justice needs of this county.
You mentioned the casinos, and of course we're sitting right over there. That wall is the casino, or casino site. Do you? A lot of people are very concerned about what is going to happen with possible crime with a casino. Are you concerned about that? Do you see that perhaps the fears are unfounded, or do you see that perhaps some of this is actually relevant?
I'm concerned, but it's my job to be concerned about these kinds of things. It's my job to be hyper-focused on what's coming down the road and to focus really on public safety and criminal justice. So this is obviously very relevant to my job. Not only is it literally across the street from my main office on State Street, but it's going to reverberate, I think, throughout the county in terms of its impact. I will say that I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about a positive impact foremost over anything else. I think jobs and the opportunities that will come with this $1 billion investment by MGM is going to make a big difference. And I think there's a really strong connection between economic opportunity and public safety. I think folks who in some ways are desperate, in some ways can't find gainful employment, turn to crime in situations. So I think where we have this opportunity that this is going to bring, I think it's going to help us to some degree in criminal justice. But my concerns are, I think most practically, just a lot of people in one place where there's gambling and there's alcohol and so forth is going to create some problems there on that casino site and around. I think they're going to be limited. I know the state police is already focused. They've got a great team together already for the Springfield casino site. They're going to have upwards of 30 troopers, I'm told, dedicated to the Springfield casino site.
Wow.
Yeah, along with the Springfield Police Department, already ahead of the curve, doing a terrific job anticipating the issues, making sure that there's strong visibility to make sure people feel safe and actually are safe. And I think the work that I've done with Commissioner Barbieri and Mayor Sarno on public safety is really, I think we're really in a position where we're going to be prepared for it. But you know, there are those practical, more simple crime concerns. But also we're looking forward. I've worked with the Attorney General on some issues. We're working with the federal government on human trafficking issues. We're talking about what more complicated or sophisticated crime issues might come from a casino and looking at what's happened historically in other places and being prepared for those things and making sure we have the resources in place. So as I've tried to do in my first 2.5 years in office, I've tried to bring together law enforcement and bridge gaps and work together cooperatively to make sure that we're handling criminal justice problems as best as we can and what we're prepared for any issues coming down the road. So as I said, the United States Attorney's Office, the FBI, ATF, and DEA, I think are prepared. We have a human trafficking task force. We're talking about these issues. We're going to be ready for them. In my dealings with the city of Springfield, Springfield Police Department, the state police, and the Attorney General, I think we're going to be prepared for whatever issues come. And again, I think largely it's going to be a positive impact, and I'm excited about it.
A few moments ago, you mentioned the impact that the opioid addiction crisis has on your office, certainly. So let's talk a little bit more about that. During the last election cycle, I mean, every candidate running for everything was talking about the opioid crisis. So we'll fast forward to now. What has happened? Has there been any progress in terms of dealing with it, either in terms of diverting addicts out of the jail system and into programs where they can recover? Has there been any progress in stemming the tide because of opioids flooding our community? I mean, we hear about this every day. The police are busting someone and they're discovering huge amounts of heroin, for instance. So can you give us an update on, past the election, what's now actually happening with this issue?
Yeah, I think we've made very significant strides in some places. With that said, this is still an epidemic. This is still a devastating problem for many people across this Commonwealth and many families that are dealing with this issue. So we're seeing the numbers, the overdose numbers, that give us a sense of where this is, and they're steady, I think, at this point from last year, and last year was up from the previous year. But what I think is important about what I've tried to do, and what I think government across Massachusetts, led by Governor Baker, has done, is to disabuse people of the notion that addiction is a moral failing. Addiction comes with, bad choices, and is again some indication of a failure by that individual. When what we know and what science tells us is that it's a disease, and it comes with some initial choices. Obviously, when you begin by using a substance, whether it's a substance that's prescribed or it's a recreational drug that leads to something else. But what we know about the brain and how it works and how these drugs are working is it becomes a disease, really in many ways unlike any other disease. So with that understanding, I think we've been able to build on that in terms of how we're dealing with this problem with the public. I think the way in which we're resourcing the problem has gotten much better based on the understanding it's a disease. We've been able to remove the stigma, I think, to a large extent. So people who are dealing with addiction don't feel that they have to be in the shadows and they have to hide this issue. And I hope that more numbers of people are getting help as a result of the public's understanding, and I think the medical community's understanding about the issue. What my office has done in particular, though, Michael, to address it more to what I've done in my first 2.5 years, I could probably go on for a while, because it feels like almost the majority of my time is dedicated to this issue in some shape, form, or fashion. But what we tried to do was deal with it really on both ends. And in some ways, you can equate it to a supply and demand issue. So what we've tried to do on the supply side of things is to enforce the law as strictly and as vigorously as possible against those who are profiting from the issue of addiction. And there's a very serious distinction there that I think people have to understand, that there are people who are trafficking in drugs and distributing drugs, particularly heroin and fentanyl now, that is in fact breeding addiction and causing these overdose deaths that are so tragic. And they do it for profit. It's a business. And we're fortunate to have laws that address this in terms of trafficking of heroin, trafficking of fentanyl now, which was a law that came on the books last year. The legislature keeping up with this problem. And what I've done in my administration is to encourage law enforcement across the county, and to the extent that I can control it, I have a state police unit working on narcotics. We've directed them towards this problem. And I've said to the people who will listen, to the people who I can direct, I want you out there. I want to take heroin off the streets, and I want to take the dealers and the traffickers off the streets for as long as we can. And law enforcement across the board, from federal to state to local, has been tremendous and very successful, as you indicated in the question about seeing that these busts are happening. We just had a 25,000 bag bust about a month ago. We took 3 luxury cars, about $100,000 in cash off the streets in Holyoke. But that's one of dozens. And what we're doing in the criminal justice system, again, is enforcing the law as strictly as we possibly can against those people profiting from addiction. On the demand side, the folks who are coming into the court system, clearly with the signs of addiction, clearly in the throes of addiction, we're doing our best to address that core problem of addiction and getting them the help that they need and that they deserve, because again, this is a disease. So what we've been able to do in partnership with the trial court in the last 6 months is form a drug court. Mm-hmm. And it's been discussed for years here, and we were finally able to get it off the ground, again in partnership with the trial court and some nonprofit service providers. And that's really a system by which we can take individuals with addiction who come in with relatively minor crimes and put them into the drug court, really take their case out of the regular stream of cases and put them into the drug court, where the judges, the probation officers, the prosecutors are all fully in understanding of the issues there and equipped to deal with those issues and provide services, whether it's probation, some disposition to their case that's really gonna thoroughly and meaningfully address the issue of addiction. And that was a big step. What I did about a year ago or a year and a half ago was form the Hampden County Addiction Task Force. And what it does, it brings together many agencies and many leading agencies and people in the addiction and recovery communities. We meet monthly. What we've been really engaged with for this first period is on the issue of data, making sure that we can collect data as real time as possible about overdoses, about where there are spikes in deadly overdoses, so we can then direct resources appropriately to hopefully suppress those issues and save lives ultimately. But every month we've got 30 or 40 people coming into my office to deal with this issue, talk about it, and we're taking on various projects as we go on from that data piece onto other things. But what we've done in terms of education and prevention, I could go on for probably hours. We're talking to young people about the issue. We just filmed a documentary, really, or a public service announcement. It's about 30 minutes long that my office funded, and it involves some of the experts in the community, people who have lost children to addiction, and we're showing it to high schools. We just rolled it out about a month ago to Central High School as a big kind of grand opening of the piece. It was very, very well received, and we're going to go around the county to young people in high schools and show this to them and show them really what can happen, whether it's through prescription drugs, you have a sports injury or something like that, you're prescribed a drug and it turns into addiction, or you use drugs recreationally and it steps up to more serious substances. And it's a very moving piece. In some ways, I think it presents this issue in a way that should scare these young people a little bit, and at least it's going to resonate with them. But it's also a story of hope. It has some people who have dealt with addiction and are in the recovery stage and they're doing well, and they talked about how they got there and the struggle really it was to go from addiction to recovery. But it ends on a hopeful note, and it's really, really a great piece. But from our med return boxes to get unused and unwanted prescription drugs off the streets, to the education and prevention work we're doing, we think we're making a difference immediately. But quite frankly, Michael, if we have this conversation in a year, 2 years, or 5 years down the road, I think the work we're doing now is really setting us up for some long-term impact as well. And when we do have the chance to talk about this, it's a problem that in large part hopefully is in the past.
So let me ask the question that is probably the most controversial when we talk about addiction and we talk about opioids, and that's the marijuana issue. Because there are some people in law enforcement that believe sincerely that marijuana is a gateway drug. We now have recreational marijuana in Massachusetts. I think everyone is waiting to see two things happening, whether or not the Trump administration decides that the federal government is going to be enforcing marijuana laws again. And the second thing is waiting for the legislature to get its act together to come up with actually the rules and regs on how marijuana is to be sold recreationally. Does this concern you? And I have no idea what your opinion is, if you believe marijuana is a gateway drug or if you don't. How does recreational marijuana play into the entire addiction problem that we're facing, or does it play into it, in your opinion?
Well, I guess I'll be candid about it because I was against the legalization of marijuana prior to the referendum in November. It's obviously an unpopular opinion. At this point now, we know the voters of Massachusetts decided to legalize marijuana in many respects. And as you mentioned, the Joint Committee on Marijuana Regulation is working, House members and Senate members here in the state, about the specifics of what the laws will be, what the regulations will be. But I still believe that to acknowledge that we're in the midst of an addiction crisis in this state and really across the country, but we're also going to legalize for recreational purposes something like marijuana. And very often the gateway drug term is used. I'm not sure it's applicable, but there's no question. And if you look at the studies on the way marijuana affects the brain, particularly the developing brain, so kids from 13, 14, all the way up to 21, 22, when the brain continues to develop, it affects the chemistry of the brain and leads to a propensity for addiction to other substances. That is settled science. There's studies out there that I'm not smart enough to fully understand and cite to you, Michael, but I understand it enough to know that's a fact. So to me, it was troubling to say to our children, effectively, as an adult community, we're gonna legalize this stuff and regulate it. And I think that sends a message that it's harmless. I don't think it's a harmless substance. I am not anti-marijuana in many respects. I try to take a modern perspective on it. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, but it's not a harmless substance, especially when it relates to our children. Obviously, it's going to remain illegal for kids under the age of 18.
Right.
But I think there's no question when you legalize a substance, therefore increasing access, increasing its prevalence, it's going to trickle down to young people. It's going to get in the hands of young people more readily, in my opinion. So I think if you look at the states that have legalized it in the western part of the country, they've had some problems. There's been some consequential problems with crime. There's been actually an exponential rise in serious and fatal motor vehicle accidents as a result of people driving under the influence of substances, in particular marijuana. We're talking about that very often. I was just at Holyoke High School this morning, as a matter of fact, for a Stop the Swerve presentation where we talk about impaired and distracted driving, and we talk about how impaired driving can just ruin lives, take lives away. So I think marijuana is going to have that effect, and I think it's a problem for law enforcement because unlike alcohol, it's very hard to judge where someone is in the use of marijuana and whether there's...
Let me just interrupt you a moment.
Sure.
From a prosecutor's point of view,
Yeah.
we don't have the kinds of tests that we have for alcohol. For the police to then be able to say we administered a field sobriety test or we did a blood test and turns it over to the prosecutor, and now you have that as evidence in this case. You guys don't have something like that. And I would think that this would be an issue that the state really needs to address in order to give law enforcement the tools that they need to address driving under the influence.
Precisely, that's exactly the problem, where unlike alcohol, you can't read a level of marijuana in someone's system. It's really a binary analysis. If you were to get a blood sample, it's going to indicate the presence of THC or marijuana, not any sort of level. So now that it's legalized, at what point is there inebriation to a point where you're driving your car under the influence? Unlike alcohol, where we can get a reading from a breath test or a blood test, it presents serious problems. And in my experience as a prosecutor, and we've prosecuted these kinds of cases, and there's laws on the books for drug driving, they're just historically much harder cases to prove. And frankly, it's not a Commonwealth of Massachusetts problem, it's a national problem. We don't have a means by which to effectively and accurately make these kinds of calls for the criminal justice system. And I think in Massachusetts, it's going to be a process probably of the regulations that come down from our legislature, but it's also going to be a process of case law where it's going to develop over time. So it's going to be a problem that probably has a solution that takes a while.
Something that we like to ask people on this show is why they got involved with public service. What was the motivation for you to enter being a prosecutor? Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, about how you decided to go this way? I mean, I understand, you may have decided years ago you wanted to be an attorney, but what led you to this kind of practice, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm the beneficiary of circumstances. I'm very, very lucky to be where I am right now. And it all started really with an interest in public service. My father had been a public servant his whole life, and that inspired me. But I started under District Attorney William Bennett. And before getting that position, I wanted to do some trial work. I thought I wanted to be a prosecutor, although I didn't really know what it was all about. And I had a meeting with Bill Bennett, and I was inspired by him. At the time, of course, he was in office 17 or 18 years, was very well established and respected. And I got the job, fortunately, and I fell in love with the work. I fell in love specifically with trying a case and being in front of a jury. And I think that's the purest form of legal practice. And that was really attractive and fun and exciting to me. But also, as I think time went on and I better understood the position I had, I fell in love with the work of a prosecutor. And obviously, at this point in my life, it's my firm belief that prosecutors do tremendously important work for our communities. We're the voice of victims. We're the voice of the voiceless sometimes. We represent, in some ways, victims of crime, victims of murder who can't speak for themselves. We represent the people who are oppressed, who are harmed by crime. You know, I think the work that we do around all kinds of violent crime and drug crime in poverty-stricken or poor neighborhoods, we're representing the people who can't speak for themselves, and we're trying to give them the best life and the safest place for them to live and for their families. And that I think I understood even at an early point. And I went on with my job in prosecution under Bill Bennett and then under Mark Mastriani for 6 or 7 years. And at that point, then District Attorney Mastriani became Judge Mastriani, and I was presented, you know, sort of with a fork in the road. Do I just kind of sit back and wait, or do I run? I wanted to be the district attorney. I thought at the ripe age of 33 that, you know, I could do some good and I could bring a different understanding to the office. I was really intrigued by prevention work and getting out to communities and trying to help young people in particular before they made their way in the criminal justice system. I was always saddened in a way by a prosecution of an 18 or 19-year-old young person, you know, whether it was a gun or a drug case or however serious it was. I said, what a tragedy. You know, what a tragedy that this young person with so much talent and so much opportunity before him or her, you know, made this dumb choice to do something serious, to commit a crime. And I said, boy, wouldn't it be great if just a week before this person made this bad decision, someone talked to him and said, hey, you know, smarten up, or whatever the case may be. So I was really intrigued by the notion of prevention and trying to make a difference in young people's lives and steer them away from the courthouse and ever having gone there as a criminal defendant. So obviously I ran, and I was an underdog to say the least from the beginning, but I worked very, very hard. I presented my message as best I could. I talked about the relevant issues, and I got a lot of support. And of course I sit here now as the elected district attorney, and I found it to be just incredible. And the work I get to do to help people and to affect lives and lead a great office is the greatest honor of my life.
Well, DA, thank you much for coming in on Government Matters. The whole idea of this program is to allow people to get to know people who are helping us in government a little bit better, and the kinds of jobs that they have to do, and also how they got there. Thanks very much for watching Government Matters today, and we'll be back with a new show very soon. Thanks.